So I'm Professor David Hazelgen, UCL Pro-Provost Bicentennial in the office of the President and Provost of UCL. And I do want to say that he sends his best wishes and sorry that he can't be here, otherwise he would have been because of other appointments. And I want to welcome everyone to the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and to this special event on the Brink, trade, finance and the reshaping of the global economy. And I just heard that the embargo possibly is off. Anyway, the event marks the official launch of UNCTAD's, I didn't say that right, did I? UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report 2025, which has been under embargo until just a few seconds ago. And what I want to do, first of all, is to say that I'm delighted to welcome the many people in the room and the even more online, I understand. And in fact, there are people that I can hardly even see. We've got a very distinguished audience of policymakers, diplomats, academics, media and partners who are eager to hear about the most recent report. But what I want to say is that the conversation is very timely in the context of slowing global growth, geopolitical shocks and financial volatility. The global economy is projected to slow in 2025, signalling fragility. Trade, industrial policy and finance are increasingly interconnected. And that's why the conversation is timely. But what I want to stress is that the location of the conversation is actually most fitting. It is particularly appropriate that this discussion should take place at University College London, an institution recognised as a leader in interdisciplinary research, policy engagement, governance and public value. Most importantly for me, not just in my current role, but most importantly for me in general, the discussion is exceptionally timely as we are poised to celebrate the 200th anniversary of UCL's founding in 1826. Its founding influenced by Benthamite philosophy. We were the first university to be established in London. Not everybody knows that. And the original challenger institution in England, accessible to people of all faiths or none, committed to innovation in disciplines, disruptive thinking, openness, excellence, and the dissemination of useful knowledge for the benefit of all. These are our founding values. And in February 2026, we're going to launch a year that marks 2 centuries of exceptional innovation, discovery, impact and social benefit. And we will take that opportunity to reflect on the contemporary importance of our founding values and reinforce our commitment to multidisciplinary approaches to both the challenges that we face, but the opportunities that are to be taken as we embark on the 3rd century of activity aimed at positive benefit for all in this institution. And I want to say, I mentioned this before, that listening to a recent Chatham House interview with our guest speaker, Rebecca, I was struck by the way that she stressed the complexity of the economic, social and political challenges that face us, and the critical need to remember that we have agency and can control how things work out. But Rebecca emphasised the need for better understanding of how a multitude of factors and forces simultaneously operate to create conditions that need to be managed. And it seems to me that UCL, with its challenge-oriented, multidisciplinary approach, is the perfect place to continue and elaborate that line of thinking. Universities play an essential role in translating complex global dynamics into actionable insights. We work with partners worldwide to strengthen state capabilities, policy space, and inclusive governance. And I think there probably hasn't been a time when it was more important to stress the value of the work that goes on in institutions like this, the convening power to have these discussions in institutions like this. And to that extent, I'm absolutely delighted that this discussion is taking place here this evening. All of this aligns very strongly with IIPP's work on mission-oriented innovation, state capacity and public value. So I'm looking forward to what I know will be an invigorating and insightful conversation between these two exceptionally thoughtful and influential thinkers. I was going to be honoured formally to introduce Secretary General Rebecca Grynspan, but I think that Mariana's going to do it.
You can do a bit, and I
can do a little bit, and then she can do more. The first woman to lead the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, former Vice President of Costa Rica. She's a leading global voice on development, trade, finance, and debt reform. And I can tell you, having listened to a few of her speeches recently, tremendously impressed. I am not an economist, but tremendously impressed, and I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. Right. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, I think is probably known to pretty much everyone here, founding director of this institute, globally recognized for her work on mission-driven innovation, state capabilities, and public values. Professor Mazzucato set up this institute at UCL in 2018 to bring public purpose to economic theory and policy and to train the next generation of leaders, some of whom I'm sure are in this room this evening and listening online. She's another energetic and globally influential voice, and we're very proud to have her at UCL. The discussion that's going to be offered will give us shared perspectives and complementary insights into reshaping what seems to be a fragile global economy, but there will also be opportunities for the audience to participate actively in the Q&A. So I hope that you will join me in welcoming our two speakers, and I'm sure that you will have an invigorating and enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I can take that if you want. We don't need this, right? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. I think what I will say, besides that we are so well dressed, aren't we, is that Rebeca Grynspan is also the first woman Secretary General. And we have a wonderful new initiative here at the Institute, which is called the Strategic Economic Alliance, which tries to match women leaders with women economists around the world who unfortunately don't have enough of a voice. You might have heard from the FT specials recently, which is, special, what do you call it, a series, that economics is one of the most male-dominated fields. There's many more in engineering and chemistry and physics than economics, and unfortunately, some of us are sometimes also invited to kind of fly in like Martians and talk to local leaders, and we realized through the work of the Institute that one of the best ways to hold us to account was not only to do what we, I think, do well, which is to work with civil servants and not at them, but also to work with and be interrogated by local economists, women economists, who help us make sure that our own work is not being captured. We know there's lots of mission washing, for example, and different types of wonderful concepts like prosperidad compartida, shared prosperity. What does that actually mean? Where does that word come from? Where is the history of the debate and the struggle, actually, to make sure we really share prosperity? And this is why it's so amazing to have Rebeca here. She is an economist. Do I have to tell everyone where you got your BSc? Her bachelor's in economics from the University of Costa Rica, and then her master's at my old university, Sussex University. But all of her work, ever since I've met you, Rebeca, and all the panels that we often find ourselves on, your keynotes, your leadership is absolutely imbued with new economic thinking. And what is so hard, and the reason we actually set up the Institute, is to say it's not enough to just have the new economic theory. How do we practice it? But especially, how do we bring the insights from trying stuff, right, learning by doing, trial and error, on policymaking, back to the theory? And I'm going to kind of press you a bit on that today. But I also want to say that Rebeca Grynspan is a nominee for the Secretary General position, which you know is currently held by Antonio Guterres. And it's wonderful that we actually have several women who are the nominees for the next Secretary General. So we'll see who wins, but it's absolutely, either way, amazing to host you here. And maybe we can just begin, actually. I want to give you a bit of a platform just to tell us what you think the most important parts of this great report. I think your team didn't print it, we printed it. Here is how beautiful it is. As of about 10 minutes ago, it is now online. The embargo is off. It's called On the Brink, Trade, Finance, and the Reshaping of the Global Economy. And maybe I just want to just give a bit of context before handing over to you. When I say that we need that new economics, I'm not just saying it as like a nice little thing to say. To talk even about shaping an economy goes completely against the idea that at best, on the policy side, whether it's at the city, regional, national, or global level, we can fix market failures. What does it mean to shape an economy to deliver inclusive growth, sustainable growth, investment-driven growth, innovation-led growth, but also what does it mean to get out of the silos? In this report, what I love about it, it's almost therapy, which is literally like, let's all get in the room. It makes no sense to talk about trade here, finance there, development there, industrial strategy there. One of the big messages that we ourselves brought to G20 literally last week, but also COP the week before, was that the way that these conferences are actually structured, these big four are structured, doesn't lead to this discussion. You might have a finance working group, an industrialization and critical minerals working group, an industrial strategy working group. We need to start with what's to be done and then work backwards. What does it mean for how we structure trade, for how we structure finance? Instead of thinking of financial gaps, which you'll have heard there's a $7 trillion financial gap for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that makes it sound as though there's a big hole that we just got to find money around there, blend it a bit, blended finance, and then things will get solved. Whereas we know that there's plenty of money out there, and it's often the structure of the finance. So I'm going to pause here and ask you, if that's okay, to give us the kind of highlights, but to begin with this point. What I found, one of the points, if it's okay to steer a bit, is that this financialization of trade itself is one of the problems. And this country is financialized. 80% of our finance goes back to finance. Finance, insurance, and real estate is how finance works in this country. Barely even hits the real economy. So if you can maybe just start with that really important insight, which I think really stuck out. It's original. It's something that can shake people up. You said before, I want this report to make people uncomfortable, not comfortable. If maybe we can begin with any sort of summary you want to make, but then if we can go a bit deep on the financialization point. Thank you.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you all for being here. Let me just give credit for the report to Anastasia Nesvetailova. I practiced that because she is the director of our globalization and macroeconomic division. She is on the Trade and Development Report.
Another woman.
Yes, another woman. Actually now, we are parity in UNCTAD for the first time. But Anastasia directs the branch that does the TDR, and she's the director of the report. So Anastasia, thank you so much for giving me the floor, and for a wonderful report. And I think that Mariana is right, that the report brings finance into trade. And we used to talk about finance diverse from trade. And when we talk about trade, we usually think about goods. We don't think about the finance. And if you look at the report, the finance cycle and the trade cycle are totally synchronized. More now than ever, since the crisis of 2008. Since the crisis of 2008, if you look at the graph, you cannot even say which is trade and which is finance. They go together. And 90% of trade depends on finance. And so obviously, if we don't talk about finance and what that means, it's very difficult to talk about trade. I remember when in the Financial for Development conference, we were fighting for trade to be included. And this goes to your point, yes? And we were fighting for trade, and I said, but why you don't understand that trade is part of the finance for development of the countries? Coming from a small country, I told everybody, well, try to develop without trade and without hard currency, and let's how you do it. Let's see how you do it. So what you have said, that we live still in these silos, is so true. And so I think that one of the things that UNCTAD really tries to do is to bring the different aspects of trade, development, investment, technology, and finance together. So In the report, the other interesting thing, just to put out the highlights, is that you can see the multipolar world in the trade side of the equation. You see more actors, more countries coming in an important way as hubs in trade. And actually, the number of countries from the developing world, from the global south, that are participating in an important way in global trade has doubled. So you see diversification in trade. So when we talk about multipolarity and we talk about the economy, we can see that. Mm-hmm. But if we look at finance, we see the opposite happening. We see more concentration in the dollar and less activity or weight of the global south in the financing part. And so this is a divergence, in a way. There is, you see the numbers and you see, for example, the South representing 40% of trade today. The South representing 40% of GDP. The South representing 50% of the FDI, of the foreign direct investment. And you look at the finance and there is no match. And this idea that the dollar has weakening and the dollar system has weakening, we don't see that. We see that there is a decline in the reserve of the foreign exchange reserve of the central banks of the dollar. Still, the dollar is dominant, but less than before. It was 70%, if I remember correctly, Anastasia, because I'm not looking at mine. If I remember correctly,
send us little notes.
70% in 1990, in 2005 or 2000, around the turn of the century. Now, if you take away the gold reserves, is around 57%, if I remember correctly. But it's true that gold has gone up as a reserve asset of the central banks. But if you look at all the rest, that is part of the financing chain of trade, that is the payment system, the stocks market, all that has to do with the financial transactions, the dollar is more dominant today than before. There is a question there that I don't dare to answer, that if there is a different perception between the private sector and the public sector. Mm-hmm. Because in the public sector, you go for a little bit more diversification, but in the private sector, you don't see that. You see the private sector going very strongly still in the dollar system. And we don't see any other currency really challenging the dollar. Not close. So the weakening of the dollar, we have strong doubts that that is happening. So you have these two things. But what is difficult for the global south or for the developing countries is that they have no control, no power on what happens in the financing side, but what happens in the financing side affects tremendously the real part of the economy and the trading participation of the global south.
Yeah.
I will stop there and I will make some other comments.
Sure.
Afterwards.
I mean, feel free to go on, but just on that point, it's interesting because there's different initiatives. First of all, this report is not only a massive contribution to the debate, but also is connected to the work that UNCTAD itself has done in its role, for example, at the Seville Financing for Development Conference, which was 10 years after the one in Addis, where all the discussion was, again, around how do we not only realign finance, but make sure there's also directionality. Yeah. There's no point in creating this finance, then it's just dispersed. But so how, you just mentioned public-private, work together. One of our critiques that we actually made at in Seville, in a panel actually with Ajay Banga at the World Bank, was that we also need to really kind of question the words that are being used, like blended finance, right? There's been so much attention to blended finance going from billions to trillions, when actually it's only raised about 15 billion a year, and even that amount of money is hardly even being put with a strong direction around the SDGs, let alone getting the right partnership. If you look at how the deals are done, there's very little additionality in terms of for every kind of dollar, how much is actually raised. It's about 30 cents. Yeah, I made a mess. I have a feeling this cup has a hole because it's just, yeah, oh, it has a crack. That's interesting. Anyway, oh well. Well, see, we're women. We start cleaning even when making sure things aren't getting out of hand here.
I will put it here.
Yeah, maybe we can get a towel. Anyway, so not only low directionality, low additionality, but also very problematic structure of the partnership. There's kind of the socialization of risk, privatization of reward. So can you just say a bit about also that it's not only about this kind of US dominance versus a more multipolar side of trade, but also what you were just getting at, which perhaps you can go deeper on, which is that the way that the World Bank itself and some of, and the IMF, of course, and the whole IFA structure, the international financial architecture, which is the Bridgetown Initiative, as a kind of ally in some ways of this report. The points that have been made there is that we really have to rethink the Bretton Woods system. It's not just about the dollar. It's about voice. There's a lot in the report about whose voice is actually at the table for real, real deliberation. And I think that connects it back to what Mia Motley has been fighting for with the Bridgetown Initiative. If you can just kind of bring us also to that, which is the redesign of these financial institutions that is actually required to accompany what you're arguing in the report.
Yeah, it's very important. We were very active in the FFD4, as you know, and there are like three parts of the international financial reform where we had been pushing very hard, and it very aligned with Bridgetown and what Mia and you have been saying. First of all, the problem of debt. Yes, the number that we have put out there is that today there are 3.4 billion people that live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than on health or education. So let alone talk about SDGs. Yes. Or, you cannot invest in health, you cannot invest in education because you are paying so much for debt. And Africa, for example, is paying between 4 and 8 times the rate of interest that Europe or the US are paying. And if you look at the fundamentals, there are nothing in the fundamentals that will justify that. And so there is a problem here with the debt structure and the conditions of the market, but also there is no stable mechanism for debt restructuring. And so what we are saying is true, because what you hear is there is no debt crisis because we haven't had more defaults. And it's true. We haven't had more defaults because you, as a Minister of Finance or President, have to be almost crazy to default when you know that won't help you, that you will have to wait 3, 4, 5 years to be able to restructure your debt. Nobody will give you 1 cent, and there is no point in doing that. And so they default on development instead of defaulting on the debt. And that's why we say it's true that the markets are not in crisis, people are. And when people are in crisis, you don't care because the markets are not in any problem. Yes. And many of the...
We just went through a budget cycle here where the whole fear was the bond markets. We forgot how do you deliver for the people in the country. But anyway.
I'm not in politics. So first, we need a system for the debt. And the truth is that the situation is not getting better. It is getting worse. Actually, 1 year ago, it was 3.3 billion people. Now it's 3.4 billion people living in countries that have this problem or that are defaulting on development. From 3.3 to 3.4, let me just remind you, is 100 million people more. So we sometimes lose what that means. Yeah. The second problem is what you just said, finance. Finance for development. How do we finance development? And there is no doubt that countries have to make an important effort on domestic resource mobilization. Yeah, we need to deepen the markets, we need to develop the capital markets, we need to tax, properly. I have no doubt with respect to that, because it's the first thing we hear. Yes. But the problem is that even when you do the right thing, you can be in trouble because the private sector is not investing in these countries. Yes. They go to the emerging markets, they go to the mature markets, they buy their own shares, but they don't invest in countries that they perceive as very risky.
By the way, just on the buying their own shares, the 7 trillion financial gap for the SDGs, 7 trillion is also the same number that's been spent by the largest S&P 500 companies just buying back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive
And with
pay.
the QA, we saw that,
Yes.
across the board. And so how do we have a system that can direct finance and investment to the countries that need it most? And that is really the question. And for that is that we established the multilateral development banks, regional and global. Yeah? But these banks, I think that there are two problems there. First, they are too small. They don't like us saying that, but they are too small. The World Bank, individually. The World Bank is today 1/5 of what it was to the global economy in the 60s. 1/5. Because they have not been capitalized properly. And here I tell them, and I tell the two institutions of the Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank, that what we want is stronger public institutions at the global level. We want a stronger IMF, but in the right direction, and we want a stronger World Bank. We need it, because we need to crowd in private investment with the World Bank. And when you put together, and that's what I was telling you before, in our World Investment Report with respect to renewable energy, we said that when you have public resources from the country together with a multilateral institution and the private sector, the price of capital goes down 25%. So instead of thinking of de-risking projects where the private sector has to assume risk, we have to think about how do we bring down the cost of capital for these countries. And that's a whole different discussion. It's not the blended way in which at the end the cost of capital goes up. Because that's also what happens in the blending that has been done, that the cost of capital goes up instead of going down.
And of course then there's a vicious cycle, because ultimately the debt crisis that you very eloquently talked about, the impacts that has on people's lives, where education and health are not spent on because all the money is going to pay back the debt. If then you don't invest because you don't have that fiscal space, you get even more indebted. So it literally is a vicious cycle, and it's set up to fail. But maybe just maybe leaning on the fact of also the country you're from, the region, Costa Rica, Latin America, the UN Economics Commission for Latin America was so important for many years, also for bringing new ideas. If we think also of the era of Furtado, of Prebisch, also Albert Hirschman, do you feel that right now, it can't just be about reports from, whether it's academic institutions, UN agencies, that we need to almost revive? I see also Robert Wade in the room, different, actually going back also. It's not just about new economic thinking. We need to disrupt how we think about the economics and the economic assumptions that continue to lead to so many of these dysfunctions, if you want, that you're talking about. And you mentioned public banks. There's 22.2 trillion, that's a lot of money, in the national banks, in the national public banks, the BNDESs of the world. There's 2.2 trillion in the multilateral development banks. But if the economic reasoning underlying them continues also to make them really risk averse, and in some cases completely dysfunctional, that they will only actually fund projects in particular types of sectors that are more secure, particular parts of the regions that are kind of less risky, but also require private finance to be there before they get involved. That's completely the opposite, right? Of a more kind of Keynesian, counter-cyclical, but also really making things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise in terms of additionality. So if you can maybe just talk about also your own thinking, and it doesn't have to be necessarily linked to the report, but also your own kind of mind as an economist working in this very difficult moment that the report lays out clearly on where the new economic thinking also should come in, because otherwise we're just going from policy report to policy report, and the underlying economic theory remains the same. So we're kind of surfacing on the icing and not the cake.
Can I have both?
Yes, definitely. And there are drinks and good food upstairs afterwards for everyone.
No, let me, first of all, I think that we have to be a little bit humble here, because let's say that we haven't been very good in the projections of how the economy is working, and obviously we see things changing in the economy, and we need to understand that much better. And sometimes because we try to put everything under one lens, or the way we used to think about it before, we cannot understand. And the truth, and I think that Hazel was saying this, the truth is that the reality is much more complex today. And reductionism is not going to save us. Only complexity will save us. I really believe so.
And the capacity to govern complex processes.
And there, you are right. At least in Latin America, you can say that the capacities for strategy and planning were weakened during the Washington Consensus. And that is part of what happened, that the institutional capacities of the state have to be rebuilt in many of the countries. The countries that were able to keep more of those capacities are doing better. Yes, the ones that they had, the groups, the expertise that in the state, to be able to advise better, to negotiate better.
We actually did a study with UNDP during COVID of which countries in the developing world did better, and it was Rwanda, Kerala, Togo, Vietnam, on the back of investments they had made within their civil service from previous pandemics, as opposed to just outsourcing that capacity.
Well, I can tell you in my own country, when in the 90s in the 80s we were negotiating the debt. Yes, we have never had a debt problem afterwards because we negotiated very well. But we negotiated with the IMF, with the World Bank, with all the creditors, with the banks, with the private sector, and Costa Rica did very well because it did invest in the capacities for the negotiation. And I can tell you that I was in the Ministry of Finance at that time. I was vice minister. Imagine, in '86. Don't count, please. I was negotiating with the IMF, and I had my numbers. But they were accustomed to have the numbers and give the numbers to all the rest. And I will stay, for 1 week discussing the 0.01% of my budget. Yes, because I had my numbers. And so until they had to negotiate. Because they what they did at that time is just to impose the numbers and then the solutions for the numbers that they had in other countries. And the countries that didn't have that capacity did negotiate very badly. And so they didn't go out of the crisis so quickly as we did. Yes, because we negotiated better. Don't tell this to anybody, but I think that Costa Rica ended paying 16% per dollar at that time of the debt. We paid, but my point is that we did everything. We started the swaps of debt for nature. Costa Rica was the precursor, the first one to propose that. And so there was innovation, there was good capacities, and we were able to. So here, and I think that this goes, Mariana, with something that you have insisted on. The capacities of the state are very important, even for the markets to function properly, for the crisis to be managed in a different way. So we need to invest on that proactively again. The other thing with respect to theory and practice is that most of the vulnerable countries of the world need diversify their productive structure. And we all know that from long ago. We are very worried now because in the new tariff structure, the countries that have been hit the hardest are the least developed countries of the world. So there is this group of least developed countries, 44 countries in this group. They are facing now a tariff of 27% average. It's higher than UK, than Europe, than the most advanced emerging markets. It's higher than anybody else. And it's hitting them where? Not in the commodities, but in the little manufacturing that they have. So when we talk about industrial policy and we look at these countries, I can assure you that the only way they can go if this doesn't change is to be more commodity dependent, not to be more a much more diversified economy. And you know the trade system, and nobody talks about them because these are very vulnerable countries. They don't have really power to negotiate. And that's why we need a trade system that has rules, that has a framework where they can go and have a voice. That is, in a way, what you also were saying.
One of the things that we actually, we have a lot of our propaganda here. I call us the Rosa Luxemburgs of UCL. But one of the things we brought actually with our principles for an inclusive and sustainable global economy at G20 was to say, first of all, this was the first G20 on African soil. But one thing Ramaphosa tried to do, we all know what actually happens at these places with all the vetoes and so on, was to bring themes of equity, sustainability, and solidarity at the center. They were meant to be on top of all the working groups, on top of the Sherpa work, on top of the TF1s, TF2s, TF3s, and it didn't happen. There's so much backlash against actually putting solidarity. Just think even of, we all, in theory, are for green industrial strategy, but not in such a way that sucks green capital out of Africa, not in such a way that we design a CBAM, for Europe that is part of their green industrial strategy, which then doesn't embody any technology sharing, knowledge sharing, so hurts development. So these are missed opportunities to double down on these concepts, not just for nice words, solidarity, oh, it sounds so cute. No, what does it mean in the contracts, in the design of a treaty? You were saying, sorry.
No, sorry. Part of the problem in the CBAM is that the price of carbon is the same for Europe than for Gabon or for the DRC. Or
for not solidarity. Yeah.
Well, and this is not common but differentiated responsibility.
Yeah. Maybe we can also just talk a bit about leadership and differences. So even, like in Chile right now, which is very different from Argentina right now in terms of the leadership and the vision, one thing that struck me is that when there is a vision around inclusion, sustainability, and solidarity, like I believe there is right now in the Chilean government, the way that natural resources like lithium are extracted then changes, right? Because currently, we actually just co-chaired a big report on water, the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. We co-chaired it with the president of Singapore, Ngazio Conchiwila, our good friend of the WTO. And the point there is that the extraction of lithium, which is being done for one of the SDGs, right, the one around climate because of electrification, is actually hurting our waterways. It's hurting the hydrological cycle. It's very extractive also in terms of how labor is treated. So actually using the SDGs as a dashboard done well can actually help competitiveness. So for example, if the public-private partnership in Chile is that the conditions for the lithium sector to get the subsidies or the different types of supports it gets from government is conditional, that it innovates to be less wasteful of water, that it be more labor-friendly in terms of better working conditions and worker pay, that actually can help the diversification process, right? The digital economy, for example, around a natural resource to make it more sustainable. So do you want to just say something about differences also within regions? Because if we just look at cost of capital and we put all kind of the global south in a category, the numbers are striking, but also paying attention to the differences even within regions always also brings it back to agency, which you talked about in the beginning. And unless we actually use the resources we have, like procurement, like public banks, to also foster different public-private partnership. So if there's anything you want to say on also the inspiration that comes from actually looking at specific countries, specific sectors, specific types of industrial strategy, which can inform then a global report.
Well, in that sense, let's take your example. You need public-private partnerships for different technologies for that not to happen when you extract the lithium, because the same happens also in the digital realm. It's not only on the extractive, it's not only on the critical minerals. If you look at how much water you need for the chips, yes? Yeah. If you don't try to change the technology, if there are no incentives of the private-public partnership for new technologies to save water, or, for example, for not putting data centers where you don't have enough electricity for the communities or enough water for the local communities.
That happened in Oxford. They actually had to close social housing because the water was getting diverted to cool the data centers.
Exactly. And and there you need the private sector because you need the innovation, but you need the public, because if not, the incentives to the right technologies and to the saving of energy in this case, or water, won't happen. There is a report that we did on how much this is affecting the environment, that I think that is worth looking at. So these technologies have immense potential, I don't say, but we have to look also at their impact in the environment and climate change.
Why don't we start opening it up, because I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I see a lot of people who've actually contributed to some of this debate in both academia, but also on the global and national stage. So if you, okay, I will start with Robert, who I've already name-checked you. Robert Wade, who's contributed so much to rethinking development.
That was a completely fascinating conversation. Thank you. Rebecca mentioned in passing that we need a stronger World Bank, in particular to crowd in private investment, helping to reduce the risks of private investment and therefore lower the cost of capital for the country. Well, I was in Washington a few weeks ago, and I pay quite a lot of attention to the IMF and the World Bank. And the rumor I heard in the World Bank is that the next president of the World Bank is likely to be, take a deep breath, Ivanka Trump. Appointments have been made at the top of the bank of people who have no qualifications whatsoever, whose only qualification is that they're friends of Ivanka. And if that happens, I mean, that is a complete nightmare scenario. But so that's the first point. Second point is that it is really important that countries of the global south now be organizing to get plausible candidates to be the next president of the World Bank. And it is deeply shocking that in the whole history of the World Bank, only once in 2012 have developing countries put forward candidates to run against the American candidate. The Americans put up a completely hopeless man named Kim, what was his name?
Kim was the last name.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a disastrous president. That's the last time that developing countries, and even when he was up for a second term, they didn't nominate candidates to run against him despite his terrible record. So it is really important that developing countries now start the process of identifying really good candidates who can attract support, whoever the Americans nominate.
Thank you. Why don't we get 2 or 3? And can someone else choose the... Yeah, I'll let Michela. Why don't we go to a woman first? Is that okay? And then we'll do man, woman, man, woman.
No problems. Joe Lucas, Co-Create. I'm a micro SME, one of those consultants that should really be working in government, but can't.
Read the book.
Yes, I have. I've actually been in the big ones as well.
Okay.
I was at the National Emergency Briefing this week in Westminster Hall, and they made a call for a Marshall Plan. And hearing this as well, it feels like there's radical change that's needed rather than sort of micro change. What do you think needs to happen in order to enable that? within this government.
Marshall Plan for?
Basically to meet the emerging crises, which is both the climate and nature crises, but also the financial crisis sits behind that as well. So I think all these things sort of tie together as a radical shift in how we do government. The current system doesn't seem to be working to meet these challenges. So if you're looking for something of that sort of scale, how do you call people like me back into government where I can actually be effective?
Yeah, and I think it's also underlying one of the points that does come across quite strong in the report, which is that the debt crisis is actually an investment crisis, and so you can't solve one without the other. Let's get one more, and then we'll get some answers, and then we'll get another three.
Hello, Luis Vieta with the Bretton Woods Project. And as the name implies, we follow very closely the work of the World Bank and the IMF. I have a question that's related to what Robert was asking. You know, I would appreciate your insights on what do you think are the priorities for and the most likely areas where for the most likely progress on international financial architecture reform. You know, Mariana asked you, Rebecca, and I understand why you may not want to be very
That's the answer.
very direct on your answers, but for example, you know, the quota reform at the IMF has gone nowhere. We have had no reform in the 16th review. Sorry.
Can you hold it, Michaela, for him? So just a bit farther. Yep, great.
And you know, as Robert said, the World Bank has never had a non-American director, and the IMF has never had a non-European director. So, and during the FFD process that you both spoke of, there was quite a lot of pressure from the G77. You know, you have the Bridgetown Initiative, and then civil society was calling for governance reform to be part of the discussion at FFD4. And you saw resistance from both the bank and the fund and their shareholders saying, no, the shareholding structures are set in stone by the agreements, and these are not up for the discussions during the FFD process. So given this context, I wonder where you think, where are the potential for progress in those areas? Thank you.
I don't want to answer. No, let me take all of them. Well, first of all, I think that what you said, Robert, you know, goes straight to the fact that we have had to fight very strongly for the UN to have any voice in the economic discussion. Yes, and part of the things that I tell also, you know, the rich countries is you cannot pretend to discuss about economics only in the organizations that you control. You will have to allow a wider discussion to take place. And I think that this is our job, to allow for that wider discussion to take place and to support the fact that the UN could be an important voice on this. And in the FFD4, several things happened that I think that are progress. UNCTAD has been asking for a borrowers club for 2 decades or 3, maybe. We haven't been able to get it.
Describe what it is for those who don't know what that is.
Yeah. Well, you have the Paris Club, where the creditor countries meet. There is no meeting place for the net borrowing countries. No meeting place. They don't learn from each other. They don't know how the debt was negotiated in one country or the other. Everything is very secretive, yes? And there is no empowerment of the voice of the borrowers anywhere. And so we have been asking for the Borrowers Club, or now is called the Borrowers Forum, you know, forever. We haven't been able to get it. Now we got it. And I think that we will establish it. And Africa has been very active, but not only Africa. The countries are very vocal about it, and they want to establish it, and they want their own space. Because when we proposed this, and even after FFD4 in Seville, you know, many people were saying, no, you have to have the creditors and the borrowers. And we said, no, this is a space for the borrowers, for their empowerment, for their voice, for their analysis, for their understanding of how to make it better. And we got it in the FFD4.
And
And for the moment, the borrowers forum. Yes. And let me tell you that it's important how you approach this, because at the beginning, many people wanted to participate, and we in UNCTAD, we were very strong in saying this is their space. They will have to establish the modalities, the governance of the borrowers forum, because it's theirs. We will support, but it's theirs because it's very important. Not to be patronizing with the countries at this moment. They have capacities, they have ideas, they have innovative things that they want to do, and you have to give them the space to do that. And so in the FFD4, we got that. There is a process that will be very difficult because many of the developed countries don't want it, but a process that could lead to a debt, a different debt treaty, or we don't know if it will be a treaty or a declaration, but at least that discussion is taking place in the UN. Yes, many don't like it, but it's happening. And I think that all this doesn't change, let's be clear, it doesn't change the world in one step, yes, but puts limit to power. In a way, that's what the UN is for, yes, is to try to have, like any government, to try to balance power. And I think that we have to look for the things that do that in a more effective way. With respect to the World Bank, well, you have a board that is diverse, and we will have to go and convince the boards and do what politics is about, that is convincing. You have to go, you have to persevere, you have to go again. You don't have to get discouraged. I remember when I got to the UN, many didn't want to go to the G20 because we were not welcome. And I said to everybody, why not? You don't have to be welcome. You have to be there and say whatever you need to say, yes? But it's this way in which, in a very invisible way, you get marginalized and you internalize that. And then you just support marginalization, yes? But I think that the UN has changed, and that in the economic field, we are trying to really say things and get things that make a difference for the countries. And
Just
and
before
that's
you
important.
Before you come to the Marshall Plan question, just because what I heard was also something that I just want to make sure you have time to address it, which is not only like who's running the World Bank or who's running the IMF, but coming back to that kind of new economic thinking or rediscovering old economic thinking that needs to be infused. Do you think that, because I know the Bretton Woods Initiative, there's different Bretton Woods initiatives. You're not the Mark Malik Brown one, right? That's a different one. Anyway, okay, I'm with Mark. Which is, what are the underlying assumptions and theoretical premises that have underlined how the loans themselves have been, dished out, conditional on, basically, to make a long story short, austerity. There's lots of talk that that's changed. And in fact, just the fact the World Bank calls itself the Knowledge Bank and has this Mission 300 program on electrification in Africa. This makes it, I think there is a lot of change happening in the World Bank, but if the loans themselves still go through the review process, which is via the IMF, if you actually look over the last 12 months, the conditions that have continued to be set, which has reduced the fiscal space, which then prevent the Marshall Plans at the national level. Can you just say something about the degree to which you think that is or is not changing, and what the report's results, if you want, would have to say if you were going to come with some pretty bold recommendations on the change needed for finance on that side?
I can do that. Can I ask the audience who has negotiated here with the IMF? With the World Bank?
Oh. Damon, from the labor perspective.
No, I have negotiated with them a lot. Yes, and I always found that the thinking in the bank and in the IMF goes farther than the operations. And that's part of the problem that I find in these institutions. you know, if you go with the people that is thinking about the world, there is a rational conversation, and there are many things that they understand and they want to change. But when you go to the operations, nothing of that thinking really goes down.
Yeah.
And I think that is a disconnect, and we should work much better in that disconnect. So I have to be full disclosure. I am a reformist, not a revolutionary. and there, you know, and
Otherwise, you won't get the top job at the UN if you start talking revolution here.
but I have to say, I don't see the world going only in one direction. I don't see that. I see a world full of contradictions, and that's what we were talking about. Full of contradictions. There are forces that go in all directions. And that's why I say that we have agency. That is not, you know, if you think that the world goes only in one direction, nothing can be done, or nothing that is done is valuable, you won't mobilize anybody to change anything, because you know, we have to believe that change is possible, because we have changed the world in many ways. And we as women know that. Yes, I had a better life than my mother. Yeah? And that didn't happen because, it happened because there was an organization and there was a feminist movement, and they were able to get us more visibility, more rights, etc. So in my life, I have seen that. So I am not, I have said this 1,000 times, I am not naive. I understand the power game of the world. I understand politics. But if you think that nothing is possible or nothing that has happened is valuable, you won't mobilize anybody, you know? And so, you know, there will be an inevitability of what we don't want to see. And I'm sorry to say this, because I really see that there has been some change. And there is more empowerment of many voices of the South that want a different set of rules to rule. And that will take time. But there is path. There are ideas. There are things that are happening. And I don't believe that the weakening of the organizations or the institutions at the global level is the way to go. The same happens with the UN. And I'm very frank about that. You know, it's true that there has been an erosion of trust on the UN being part of the solution and not part of the problem. Let's put it that way. And I don't think that we have to leave the UN, close the UN, destroy the UN. I think that we have to reform the UN. And the UN does a lot of things that are very good, but it's true that the world is different, that it has to, you know, we also have to change. We cannot see the world changing and say, oh, we have to do nothing. And so let's embrace reform in a way that will strengthen the values and that will strengthen the way that we want to go for. At least the possibilities. You know, let's at least increase the probabilities of doing the right thing.
During the reception, I'm going to have to step upstairs for 5 minutes, because as I mentioned, we're actually presenting to the World Bank Board the Jubilee Report. Damon, myself, Joe Stiglitz, and Martin Guzman. Why don't we tackle the Marshall Plan question and then get the next 3 questions?
I don't understand the question. No, you know,
Can I reframe it, maybe?
Yes,
so that there's a common language. Maybe also positioning it in a world where the development assistance has fallen, and let's not go down that rabbit hole. But is there also a case for using the report for making also much more forceful, case for that development only happens with investment? And if investment cannot happen at the national level, because Marshall Plans actually can't happen because of how we've structured finance, what is the kind of investment-led growth, and in this moment of ODA being kind of drying up, that we can actually use a crisis as an opportunity to rethink why we've actually needed all this ODA assistance, and what is the lessons for Marshall Plan kind of dynamics, which are the only ways that countries in the global north and the global south have ever actually recovered from development problems.
So let me try to understand this. Words are important, yes? And I don't know if calling it a Marshall Plan is the best way to mobilize towards what we want to achieve? That is a question. I am very, very honest about
A
that.
real fiscal stimulus,
Exactly.
economy-wide, as opposed to tinkering
But
on
the
the
problem
edges.
is that the fiscal stimulus or the easy money only is available for the developed world, not for the developing world. And so the question is, again, how do you redirect investment towards these countries? And I believe that we cannot do that unless we have an institutionality, the system, unless the system changes. I think that the countries can do more in mobilizing internal resources, and I think that that is good because it gives you some independence. You know, at the end, degrees of freedom in your policy is important, and when everything comes from outside, your degrees of freedom are less. Yes? And so mobilizing internal resources is a good agenda because it gives you more independence. But you will be capital scarce, yes? And then we need to mobilize the capital of the rest. I don't think that that will happen without the intervention of the international financial system. That, you know, and that's what happened with Addis. You know, there was this optimism in the Financial for Development in Addis Ababa that there is so much capital in the world, like you say. And I remember Achim Steiner saying they talk about trillions and trillions of dollars, and I don't see any of it in any place that I go. Yeah. So to see some of it in the places that we want that is to happen, we need the institutionality to function. And we still don't have that.
I told you I was going to do this, but the message that we brought to COP with the publication with the Brazilian government was this whole issue of also, what do we know about the ways in which at the national level, leveraging all these tools like procurement, which is often 30% of a government's budget, is critical, and we can't just blame kind of the outside finance. However, without that outside finance not being restructured for the reasons you say, there is no capacity. But we can even see in Europe, I come from Italy, where even when the money arrived after complaining there was no money, we actually had to send it back often, the structural funds, because we hadn't invested in the kind of administrative capacity, implementation capacity, let alone using the whole array of tools from public loans, guarantees, subsidies, procurement, to really catalyze with the direction, not just private finance, but that kind of economy-wide transformation. And I think the report, by linking debt, trade, investment, and industrial strategy, is great. So why don't we get another 3 questions? Okay, why don't we get 3 here, and then we go to the online?
Hi, thank you. My name is Charit. I'm from the Institute of Political Economy from Sri Lanka, global south country. We were in a debt crisis. We defaulted, went to the IMF, got an awful deal, which was really favoring the creditors, and we had hardly any capacity for an external shock. And that shock happened this week. There was a massive cyclone that hit Sri Lanka. Almost every river has overflown, every reservoir has overflown, huge amounts of floods, every bridge, roads have been destroyed, and we are in this position right now. And the question is, when the country negotiated with the IMF, just like you said, Rebecca, that there was no capacity in the country to do the negotiation. They just went and signed some rubbish deal, no pushback, nothing at all. And the question really is, what do we do now? I mean, like I said, there's a serious need for either some sort of debt sustainability, and it's to get that capacity, get that understanding of when you go back, because now we can't fulfill that IMF deal, but they can't go back blindly because they'll again be imposed with some horrible conditionalities. And the question is, what do we do in that situation, right?
2 more. A woman here, and then the guy in the back.
Hi, my name is Eugenia. I'm a reporter for Investment Monitor. I actually have a question for both Rebecca and Mariana. For Rebecca, the rumor about Ivanka Trump was spoken about before. We know that the U.S. historically has been a big creditor, a big leader in these multilateral organizations. And this past year, we've seen that support, that interest really kind of collapse because the government, the USAID and everything else. And at the same time, even in Europe, there's this big push towards protectionism because everyone has their own stuff to deal with. The UK, with the budget, everyone has problems at home, let's say it like that. what countries, what regions do you see kind of leading this reassertion into the importance of these multilateral institutions? Because it feels like with everything that's happened with the US in the past year, a traditional leader and a very powerful one has been kind of lost in a sense, or maybe not forever, but for the time being. And for Mariana, you spoke a bit about the importance of private and public partnerships. And in this past year, we've seen those happen a lot in the AI space. And I was wondering what you thought of those, because at least in the, there's very few companies kind of leading this technological revolution, and those partnerships, depending on how you look at them or not, maybe they're fair, maybe the government knows what they're getting into, do they understand AI, maybe not. What's your opinions on those two questions? Thank you.
Great. So one more in the back, and then, or actually the woman who's told me her hand was up before.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I take a lot point of reflection with this day. Thank you so much. I just put my attention. I focus on, I'm economist, I'm freelance research. I'm focused on growth, productivity, development, and human rights as well. So I note just that usually we spoke about productivity and development, but without to think exactly at the geopolitical and new reality. Not you, of course, you and the other, Rebecca, and you, Professor Mariana, you are really update about this, and thank you for this work, because I think we stay in the new environment with BRICS country are increase. I don't speak about the conflict that is present, of course, a revolution in the Europe and in the world. The new policy of USA that are become more protective, and as well the emergent innovation with IE. So I think when we speak about development, we need to focus on our European model of development in increase productivity and grow. And this impact also the new human right, because economic human right, we don't have a.
Can you get to the question? Sorry, just...
The question is how we can increase the general GDP, productivity, and grow. Also down the view of the new geopolitical bloc, and also about the specialization on the market. Is a concept in the 117 with the Smith. I think it could be a nice point of reflection to come back and to integrate more cooperation.
Great.
Thank you.
Just because I had taken the floor away from the hand I'd said, but really brief, just the question bit, and then we'll take these four.
Yeah. Hi. My quick question was, someone was talking earlier about a new leader of from the global south. Can't remember who was saying that.
Robert.
My main inspiration for leaders who are really doing something different is from a country called Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. But what he's done in the last few months, not just the last few years, that he's basically flagged up that Africa's been getting ripped off for 60 years, Western Africa, by way of tax receipts and minerals being stolen at gunpoint by France and much of Europe. So when I look at Europe for the last 50 years, all the
Europe question, by the way.
yeah, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. Everything that we have in Europe, all this green transition, is built on the slavery of Africa. So what did Ibrahim Traoré do in the last few months, in addition to actually taking his country back? He's officially said no to the United Nations, no to the IMF, no to the WHO. So I want to ask, what qualities are we looking for in a leader from the Global South if they do not resonate with Ibrahim Traoré? He's actually said to these three-letter organizations, we've had enough of the threats. We want our sovereignty, national sovereignty, over control from international organizations.
Let's get the answer. Thank you so much. Excellent question. So,
okay, Sri Lanka. We were in touch with Sri Lanka before they were negotiating, but there was no borrowers forum. They had nobody to talk to.
And
nobody
no loss
could,
and damage fund, right?
you know,
It's not
loss
being
and damage
applied
fund.
to Sri Lanka.
And you are absolutely right that the climate change is changing everything for these countries. There is no, we have been very strong in saying that the sustainability, debt sustainability assessment is wrong for most of the countries. And that one of the things that we have to change specifically is the way the debt sustainability assessment is being done. Because it is being done only to pay, but not to develop. So, you know, you are in a cycle where you don't get out of it. I heard one of the bankers, private bankers, once said that they are losing their trust in the international organizations because countries come back and come back with the same problem. That before, we used to have more success in countries going out. But now, if they repeat themselves, they also lose, you know, faith in the system. So I think that is in the best interest of everybody to get this right. And with respect to climate change, you are absolutely right. That's why we have been fighting together with the Bridgetown effort to get the post clauses in the contracts of the loans. Because when you have a cyclone, and what happened to you, but also to all the other countries, Indonesia is terrible, Malaysia also. So we have been fighting for post clauses because of climate change to be included in the contracts of debt. So these two things would have helped Sri Lanka a lot if they were in place. So let's continue fighting for this. Yeah? And I think that Sri Lanka can ask for help from other countries that have negotiated. And from us. You know, we are more neutral, we are not creditors, so maybe we can help in a better negotiation. With respect to protectionism and who is leading in the multilateral institutions, let me say that I think that there is a new coalition developing that is of the small and medium-sized countries, because we cannot play the power game. So we need framework, we need rules, we need we need to agree to be able to thrive. And I think, and this is not only north-south. I think that it can cut across the north and the south, because in Europe you also have small countries that are suffering. So I think that you can see there, for example, in the Pact of the Future in the UN, you had Africa saving the pact. And they came with one voice, and Europe supported it because they felt that they will cause much more damage, even if they were not completely convinced about everything. So I think that there is something there that is a platform of a majority of countries. And the question is, if you have that coalition, how you still make the big stay engaged. Yes? Because it's not, we don't want a fragmented system, yes? We want a functioning system. So I think that we have to do everything to maintain the others engaged, but I think that there is more power and more voice if you come with that coalition. And it's to be seen, yes? We don't know. And this goes to your point of candidates of the Global South. I think that you are right. We have to push for it. And there are good names that can come for, even if you lose, you have to push for that path to be open. Yeah.
But is UNCTAD doing anything to coordinate an effort to find suitable people?
Or instead of answering a question that you didn't have your hand up, maybe you could just transition to the one at the door that was talking about kind of style of like the quality of leadership and where we currently see or do not see, and what inspiration one can draw from Burkina Faso.
I don't know the Burkina Faso situation that well. I know a lot, but not that well. But let me try not to answer to the specific, but to say, I see both. I see very bad leadership and very good leadership. And I don't think that there is a way to answer to good leadership, let's put it that way, if you don't have a system that allows to defeat the one that is bad.
Yeah.
Okay? If you cannot change, yes, you will never get it right.
Yeah.
Yes, even if you get it wrong sometimes. Yes. The only thing that democracy does is to allow you to change.
Yeah.
Yes. It's not that allows you to have the right government or the right decisions, but allows you to change. Yes. The problem is that the democracy is in crisis.
I think it actually links to the question, to the part of your question they were also asking to me is, I mean, what I see is also that the vision at the top completely affects also what happens at the bottom. So if you don't have, even coming to the Chilean versus Argentina example, but even the Biden versus Trump, it's interesting in terms of AI and chips and so on. It's not just about industrial strategy, for example. It's how do you bring inclusion to it. And it's interesting that in terms of the Biden kind of industrial strategy, the CHIPS Act, which we actually helped to inform, we worked very closely with the Secretary of Commerce, Raimondo, on this, the fact that there was actually conditionality, not the dysfunctional conditionality that reduces fiscal space, but the conditionality on private sector investment to, first of all, reinvest profits and not to just give it out to shareholders, so there is no share buybacks, improving working conditions, worker pay, using energy efficient supply chains at the center of a contract, right? So, Damon there works with the labor movement. The labor movement understands negotiation, right? How do you really rethink the deal part of a Green Deal in terms of a symbiotic and not a parasitic public partnership? And in this country, opening up the whole National Health Service as data for Palantir, a U.S. defense/AI company, is obviously a problem. But then how do you get the confidence in the room? And when you are just desperate to attract capital, whether it's because of Brexit or because of how the credit ratings and the cost of capital are, if you want, hurting you, I think that point of having not just a leadership, but also a coalition of the willing, it's very hard even in COVID to survive without a coalition of advanced purchasing agreements, for example, to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry. Why don't we go to the online questions? Yeah.
It's true, but the political economy of each country is
Exactly.
is so different.
But when we put them under like developing country or global south, the differences between global south countries in so many of these issues of, again, how not just the leadership, but any sort of vision, think of Lula versus Bolsonaro, without going into politics because you can't do that. But obviously that would completely affect both the structure of an industrial strategy, the structure of how a public bank works with the private sector. So giving that granularity of even within Latin America, what happened, when it happened, what have we learned, is something that we very much dedicate ourselves to. It's not just public purposes. Let's study with case studies what works, what doesn't. I know there's some online questions for you, and I'm just going to let you answer this. Should we take two before time's up?
Perfect, yes. I know we're all tired. There are over 14 questions online, all very good.
40 or 14?
14.
Oh, we can do
That's
them.
my accent. Yeah, we can do all of them. So one of them is about, which I think is extremely important, and for both of you, is about private-public partnership. And it's from Associate Professor Claire, who is actually researching digital and financial accountability. So Claire is saying that the more she looks into this, the more she sees private and public partnerships, especially in digital infrastructure and public services, is still operating with accountability structures grounded in private sector logics of risk, value, and performance. Right? So rather than public purpose and public value. So her question for you both is, how can governments and global institutions redesign PPS so that accountability frameworks genuinely align private sectors with public purpose? Very good question from our perspective. Another one is a bit speculative, but I think it's worth to talk about that. Will BRICS grow, and as a strong institution perhaps replace the Bretton Woods institutions, or at least challenge the Bretton Woods institution? And perhaps the last one, no? Okay, that's fine. Let's go.
So why don't we start with the second one? Because I think by talking about the coalition of the willing, it sounds like you were moving in that direction.
There have been changes because during COVID, it's true that the G20 took some decisions that were not bad, including the SDRs and the special drawing rights. And we have to remember that happened, and happened because there was a lot of push, there was a coalition in favor of the SDRs, and the G20 took that decision, and at the end, the US that was vetoing the decision agreed, and that made a difference for a lot of countries, yes? And then we had also the recycling of the SDRs, where there was also a coalition. There was not only, the board. It didn't come from the board. It came from outside to the board with a lot of studies and well-crafted ideas for the recycling of the SDRs. And then you had the RST, yes, the Resilient and Sustainability Trust. And so maybe it's not all what we want to see. I wanted to see this in the development banks, not in the IMF, because in the development banks we can reproduce it 1 for 5, and in the IMF is 1 for less than 1. But at least that was an opening and an innovation within the IMF. So it happens. It's a lot of work, but some of the changes can be done because it's the same as in the Security Council of the UN. You have circles of influence, and you don't want to pay too high a cost, okay, for example, taking a decision as you would have taken the decision 30 years ago. You pay a higher cost today if there is more transparency, if there are more organizations that really look at what is happening, if they say, no, you committed all this money that you say is available, but you haven't disbursed the money, for example, that we know that happens with the World Bank. Exactly. And so you press the organization, the institution, the transparency, the accountability in the institution. And I think that makes a difference.
Unfortunately, we are at time. So for the first question, Danny Roderick and I luckily wrote a whole paper on that, so read the paper, on how to build different types of public-private partnerships, which makes no sense, of course, if it's not actually initially even beginning with a direction. Only if you have a direction, a vision. A mission doesn't even make sense to design a public-private partnership in a way that is, in fact, symbiotic with a public purpose. But can I just say, first of all, let's not forget that the reason we're here is to launch this amazing report by the team at UNCTAD called On the Brink, Trade, Finance, and the Reshaping of the Global Economy. And what I love of what you did tonight, Rebecca, which is, I think, very much in your spirit, you're very forthright on the challenges, but precisely due to the not naive positivity, but the radical positivity, maybe reform in terms of how we actually seek the solutions, but we have to be radical in what the problem is, but also remember there are very good things actually happening, but they're currently just peripheral. They are the exceptions. How do we systematize that good? It can't even happen if we don't recognize the good. So thank you for bringing also this positive message. And we hope that, again, with C, this Alliance of Women Economists, where we are currently working in Brazil and South Africa and Mexico, we can also count on you, your leadership and mentoring. But anyway, thank you everyone for coming. Upstairs we have drinks.